The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one to him as well. If anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand him your cloak as well. Should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go with him for 2 miles. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not turn your back on one who wants to borrow." The Gospel of the Lord. There's kind of two puzzling things about the Gospel today. The first thing that is puzzling is this idea of turning the other cheek and giving no resistance to one who is evil. It is because of passages like this that people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Karl Marx thought that Christianity was one of the worst things that ever happened to humanity. They thought that following the teachings of Jesus meant that Christians were basically to be pushovers, and Christians would often submit themselves to injustice, and they would be weak, and they would be victims of tyranny and injustice. Those modern atheists are misunderstanding what Jesus is saying here. Jesus not always speaks literally. Sometimes Jesus exaggerates in his teachings. We know he wasn't speaking literally here because you might recall that later on in Jesus' own ministry, he was struck on his cheek, right, by the servant of the high priest. And Jesus didn't simply turn the other cheek. Rather, he responded and defended himself. Likewise, throughout the history of Christianity, many of the martyrs, even though they submit themselves to the cross of martyrdom, they still defend themselves, and they still try to argue against the injustice. And so Jesus wasn't speaking literally here in this moment. What he was getting at was being against vengeance and resentment and retaliation. What separates the Christian message from other messages is not that we are to be pushovers, but rather we are to always resist the temptation to resentment and vengeance, retaliation. Which brings up another question from this gospel passage today. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Does anybody know where that is a quotation from? It's from the Old Testament. It's from the book of Exodus. So God in the Old Testament, he commanded that if someone takes the eye of another, their eye should be removed. A tooth for a tooth. It seems kind of harsh on God's part. And when you realize that, you might have that question. Why would God command that in the Old Testament? In order to understand this puzzling teaching, you have to understand the context and the history of the Old Testament. In the days of the Israelites, in the days of Moses, if somebody were to pluck your eye out, oftentimes that person, as a response, would not just simply have their eye removed, but rather they would be murdered in retaliation, right? When people were offended or harmed, oftentimes the retaliation was even worse than what that person had committed. And so God, in an act of mercy, was saying, if someone removes your eye, the most that you can do to that person is an equal retribution by removing their eye. Somebody knocks out your tooth, the most you can do is to remove their tooth. And so God was gradually taking those people out of a lawless culture in which there was no true laws or retributive justice, but oftentimes vengeance and retaliation was not in accord with justice. All throughout the history of salvation history, God takes a people who are a lawless culture, a culture without justice, and he slowly brings them along. Just as you would do with a child. When you have a child, you don't tell them all of the laws at once. You lead them along slowly. And God does that throughout the whole Scriptures, culminating in the teachings of Jesus, which call us not just to justice and equality, but call us to even more, to perfection. Not only to not over-retaliate, but to not retaliate at all. Christ always calls us to something higher.